a track record of wildlife and agricultural research. So why are we talking about carbon as well as wildlife? Well, we take a step back. The carbon cycle, that's the balance of carbon in the biosphere, soil, oceans, living things, mainly plants in terms of bulk, the atmosphere, but also fossilized carbon. But over the last 150, 200 years, this balance has been perturbed by the use of fossil fuels and by changes in land uses management, such that the pool of carbon in the atmosphere and the oceans has increased, whilst those in the soil and vegetation have reduced. And all that extra now free carbon is causing the effects that we see as climate change or climate warming. If we add to this other climate warming gases that are not part of the natural carbon cycle, chiefly nitrous oxide, but lots of industrial chemicals like refrigerants and propellants, we have a large amount of both fossil and industrial emissions in the atmosphere. But land management as well contributes to this atmospheric pool, particularly things like land clearance, soil tillage, and fertilizer use and production as well. So globally in the UK, agriculture is a big player in national emissions, and so has the power to influence the path of climate change. But it's also a receiver of the effects of climate change. I mean, we all know about, in this country, recent droughts and flooding, unpredictable and changed rainfall patterns, and this is being echoed across the globe. It's increasingly altering the varieties and species of crops for which our climate space is suitable to grow. It makes agricultural operations harder and difficult to plan. And there will be increases in pests and diseases associated with the changing climate. But given all this, we simply can't stop farming because it's an important provider of provisioning services, most obviously food, but also it is a great influence on water and water usage, and lots of other sometimes less tangible services like wildlife habitats, landscape values, cultural values, and what we're talking about now, climate regulation. So we know we have to change things, but how do we do so whilst maintaining and enhancing the provision of those services I've just mentioned? We now have to view land as multifunctional, even if its main purpose is farmland. Because changing one thing will always change other things along with it. So we see that all sectors of our economies now need to do two things. They need to reduce our future emissions of climate altering gases as much as we can, and to remove, or is often termed sequester, as much of the existing climate pollutants in the atmosphere as we can. Now, opportunities for both of these differ between industrial and economic sectors, but currently agriculture, land use and forestry, sometimes known as AFOLU, are the only sectors that have the capacity to do much of the second. That's actually suck, particularly CO2, out of the atmosphere. Though agriculture is probably the least able of these to sequester carbon. But there are things that we can do to reduce our emissions as much as possible. And one of the first of these is knowledge, to know how the climate impact of all the things we do as part of agriculture. Now, some of these things are well known already, and others are just starting to be elucidated, particularly by people such as our first speaker. I'll now introduce Dr. Jenny Bussell, who's a soil scientist who specialises in exploring how soil management impacts on soil health and greenhouse gas emissions in agricultural systems. She's previously worked as a research fellow at the University of Nottingham on water and soil in sugar beet crops, and studied climate change predictions of elevated CO2 and UVB influenced plant and soil crop interactions. This work focused on greenhouse gas emissions and soil microbial health, which have remained of key interest for Jenny during her career. Jenny will now tell us about her work at the Allerton Project in Leicestershire, on live carbon emissions following agricultural operations and impacts on microbial diversity. Over to you, Jenny.
Thank you very much, Rob. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for the great introduction, Rob. So if you can all put in your Q&A questions in the Q&A section as I go through my talk, because I'd love to see them all at the end and have a great discussion. As Rob has just said, I'm going to talk about my work at the Allerton Project and mostly about soil carbon, which is a real key interest of mine here at the Allerton Project. So at the Allerton Project, for those of you who don't know us, we are a demonstration and research farm. So we have about 320 hectares. Most of them are currently in field trials. And then we have a visitor centre. So we have people come and visit us, take a walk around our farm and really discuss our research and receive training. And a lot of that at the moment is focusing on soil biology, soil health, and carbon sequestration. So, as I said, I am a soil scientist and I really do focus on the soil and carbon in the soil. And the thing about soils is that they have so many important functions for us. So they regulate water flow, they regulate gas exchange, and they cycle nutrients, which is essential for plant growth. They can also store carbon as part of the carbon cycle, which, as we know, is important for carbon sequestration, and break down soil contaminants. But in order to do those functions, they need to be a healthy soil, and it's really important. Those functions are vital. So we need to look after our soils and make sure they remain healthy soils. And what makes a healthy soil? Well, it's the soil organic matter or the soil carbon. So we tend to talk about these two interchangeably, and that's because soil organic matter, which is the dead and decaying fraction of the soil, is about 58% carbon. So being such a high percentage carbon, it's really important in terms of carbon sequestration. All the carbon that is stored in our soils is mostly in the form of soil organic matter. Not only is soil organic matter crucial for storing carbon, but it's also the source of nutrients. So as it's broken down, yes, the carbon will be released, but so will those nutrients be cycled by microbial organisms, made available for plants, for plant growth, and so the cycle continues. So although we do like our soils to store carbon, we also need to cycle that carbon to get hold of those nutrients and grow our crops. Soil organic matter also improves the soil physical properties, such as water retention, because it's a nice spongy stuff and it just holds onto that water like a sponge. It also reduces compaction in soil and aerates the soil, allowing microbes and soil life to flourish. It is the home of most of the soil organisms, and so it supports the soil life, and soil life is actually crucial to making soils do those important functions. Some of you may have heard this before, but at just a teaspoon of soil, you can have 1 million single-cell microbes, more than 1 billion bacteria, 1 million fungi, and hundreds of other meso and macrofauna in just a tiny teaspoon. So the soil is thriving. And a recent study, summer last year, came out saying that although we previously thought maybe 25% of the biodiversity on Earth was in the soil, we've now upped that estimate to maybe around 50% of the world's biodiversity is in the soil. So looking after that soil biology is crucial to looking after our whole planet's biodiversity. And you can think about all the functions that those little tiny microscopic organisms are doing for us and for our soil. It's really vital that we protect it. So why is this soil organic matter so important? Well, I've gone a little bit into the soil health and the soil biology, but another reason people are interested so much in protecting soil organic matter is because of its role in mitigating climate change. Because it's 58% carbon, if we build soil organic matter, you may therefore assume that you are building that carbon store in the soil and taking it out of the atmosphere. But when we're thinking about carbon in the soil for climate change mitigation, we have to be quite careful and make sure it follows certain rules. For example, it needs to be an increase in carbon from the atmosphere, not just a redistribution. By this, I mean, if you have something like farmland manure or straw or something that you take and you spread onto a field, what you're actually doing is moving that carbon from wherever it was to onto your field. You are not sequestering that carbon. The carbon is only fixed by the plant when the plant takes it out of the atmosphere. So for the farmland manure, that's when it's fixed in the grass that the cows then eat. So that's how we work out that it has to be from the atmosphere, not just moved from somewhere else. It also will not increase indefinitely. There is a saturation point of every soil type, and it does depend on the soil type, with heavy clay soils having a slightly higher saturation point than sandy soils. And it's very slow to build that soil organic matter and very difficult to measure accurately. So measuring your success can also be a problem. And as I said, to release nutrients, you have to break down some of that carbon. So it must be spent by farmers to grow crops. And also it can be considered quickly reversible. So if you've built that soil organic carbon over many years, a small amount of soil disturbance, such as cultivation, can very quickly release all that soil carbon that you've stored. So this is why storing carbon in soils for climate change mitigation is quite tricky. And lastly, not all carbon is equal. So there are some forms of carbon that can break down very quickly, and that carbon is crucial to feeding the crops. If you think about your compost heap, there's some things you put in your compost heap that disappear within weeks, and that's what we would call active carbon. And that's really important for cycling nutrients and making that available to your plants very quickly. And there's types of carbon that are very slow to break down. And if you think of things like peat bogs, maybe that's an example of really recalcitrant, slow to break down carbon. And that's the kind of carbon that's really crucial for making sure we keep, because it's taken a long time to build that carbon, whereas the quick carbon is maybe the carbon you want to be preferentially spending to grow your crops, because that's the kind of carbon that cycles very quickly and doesn't become stored carbon very quickly. So it's not a simple, it's not so simple as saying just take the carbon and store it all in the soil. Sorry, I've already gone over this. So the slow carbon is things that are maybe chemically recalcitrant. So that means it's made up of chemistry that makes it very difficult for the microbes to break down, or it can be bound to particles in your soil or physically trapped within little aggregates in your soil, or in the case of peatlands, maybe buried very deep in anoxic environments, so maybe wet environments, whereas the fast fractions are those ones that are crucial for nutrient exchange that break down very quickly. So when we're considering spending our carbon and in terms of an agricultural system, we have to think in terms of the whole rotation. So a rotation on a farm may be 5 years, may even be 7 years of growing different crops and doing different things within a field. And when a farmer is thinking about their rotation, they need to be thinking about their soil carbon. It may be that they have to do something like cultivation, or they're growing a crop that's particularly disturbing to the soil that does cause a dip in your soil carbon as you release some of that carbon. So they have to spend some carbon, but then they will have to go through a stage of storing carbon, maybe through using a grass ley or cover crops for a year or something like this, which can build up their stocks of carbon again. So carbon storage isn't a linear process. It's about making sure we do as little of the downward slope as possible and maximize the amount of time we're in the upward slope in this graph in order to slowly build up our soil carbon while still using our soils to produce food. So that's a little bit of my background on how I see soil carbon storage. I'm going to talk a little bit now about some of the really exciting research we've done at the Allerton Project, directly trying to measure carbon, looking at how crop production and carbon fluctuations work in practice. And to do this, we've got these two different techniques. We've got the incredibly high-tech technique that you can see there with the yellow box. That's our gas analyzer, which directly measures greenhouse gas emissions from soil and plants. And then we've got the low-tech technique, which you can see on the other side, which is going in with an auger, taking soil samples, and then just directly measuring the amount of carbon that's in the soil. And both are incredibly useful for actually working out how much carbon's coming off your soil and how much carbon is in your soil. So this is one of the trials we have going on in the Allerton Project. It's looking at different types of cultivation, and it's been running for, I think, over 5 years now. And the different types of cultivation you can see are called CS, SS1 and SS2. CS means conventional system. It means it's rotationally ploughed on a fairly frequent rotation. So every year or every other year, it will be ploughed. Sustainable system 1, which is SS1, has slightly lighter cultivation. So it might be just lightly disked, but it tries to use less disturbance. But there are still some cultivations, whereas sustainable system 2 is a system that has very limited soil disturbance. So what we would call now maybe direct drilling or zero till. And you can see over the 5 years, that most emissions come off from the ploughed system. And this is something we've seen in much research in soil science. The more you disturb the soil, the more you break down those recalcitrant stores of carbon, the more you break down the aggregates and the carbon bound to soil particles, and you release that carbon that was otherwise stored. So you get a bigger carbon flux and you get lower stored carbon in your soil. However, we are in a really special place in the Allerton Project because we have so many trials going on. We can compare those trials with our other trials. So we have a trial that's been going on for over 10 years. I think it's now 12 or 13 years. And this trial has reached that magic point where the amount of carbon coming off our direct drill plots is now higher than the amount of carbon coming off our plough plots. This seems like a bad thing, but if you look at the other graph, which has got SOM, that means soil organic matter, you can see that our soil organic matter is higher in the direct drill plots. So what we can see here is a confusing message that more carbon is being released in the direct drill plots, but more carbon is also being stored in the direct drill plots. So how can this be? And why is this not happening in our 5-year plots? Well, firstly, we think that this is because the soil has been has improved in soil organic matter. That's the home for all those soil microbes. As you improve the home for all those soil microbes, you're going to get more happy microbes, a larger population. And that's what we measured using this microrest system. So the average metabolic response is how happy the microbes are when you feed them lots of different sugars. They breathe out lots of CO2, and we trap that CO2 and measure. And it's a kind of proxy measurement of their biomass. So you can see that we've got nearly double as many microbes in our direct drill plots as we have to our plough plot. So that's probably those microbes actively respiring, giving us that higher score of CO2 release in our direct drill plot. We also have more active carbon. So if you look at the topsoil, you can see higher amount of active carbon in the direct drill plots. Now that active carbon is the type of carbon I talked about earlier that's very quick to cycle through, very good for releasing nutrients for plant growth, also very good for microbes because it's really accessible for them. It's exactly what they want to feed on. So they're feeding on it. As they're feeding on it, they're releasing nutrients for the plants to grow. And what we've got is a really sign of a very active soil that's cycling carbon and nutrients very quickly, hence why we're getting larger CO2 flux from the direct drill plots compared to the plough plots. So within this, however, there must be some carbon losses from the plough plots. because we can't have continually more CO2 being released and also a higher amount of carbon stored in the soil. So where are the losses? Well, what we did was we went straight after the plough with our machine to record the flux from the plough plots. And that's the, I have a mislabeled graph here. Sorry, everybody. So what you can see here is the red column is actually the plough plot. So directly after the plough goes through, we have a massive flux of CO2, and that appears to be where our CO2 is being lost. It's being lost straight after the plough in an enormous flux that goes on for about 2 or 3 days. So we're getting this, spending our carbon all in one go. The soil is disturbed and all that carbon is released over a short period of time in the plough plots compared to a continual, very active carbon cycling in the direct drill plots, which is overall still lower than the plough plots, which are releasing their carbon all in one short space of time. So to summarize, I'd say that soil organic matter is the main source of carbon in soil, and it's vital. It's vital for soil health, it's vital for the soil biology and soil function. That not all carbon is equal. So some carbon is active carbon, and that's important for cycling and releasing nutrients and feeding microbes. And some carbon is slow carbon that you really need to protect and keep stored in your soil. Farming to improve organic matter means looking after your soil biology, and things like ploughing and disturbance can actually reduce your soil biology. And organic carbon is slow to store but very quick to release, as we saw from going in and measuring directly after the plough. It can be released in a number of days and take years to store. And it is a currency that must be spent. So telling farmers never to release any carbon from their soil just wouldn't work. But we must focus in regenerative agriculture on when to spend that carbon and spending it wisely, so we get the most we can from as little release as possible. Okay, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jenny, for that fascinating insight into the effects of simple soil management operations on the amount of carbon and carbon cycling that happens on farms. Next, we're going to hear from a bit of an RSPB double act, talking about some of the agroforestry and carbon calculator work that's been going on Hope Farm. So to introduce our two next speakers, Sophie Arnold has a degree in zoology, and she's Hope Farm Assistant Manager who leads the Carbon Farming Project at RSPB. In her 3 years in this job, she studied various carbon auditing tools at Hope Farm, whilst managing the 10-year agroforestry project and developing some of our guidance on climate and nature-friendly farming. Clara Robinson has a degree in environmental science and has previously worked as an environmental consultant with a focus on energy and carbon. She's been at the farm since last May, working on carbon case studies and maintaining the agroforestry project site. Sophie and Clara are going to tell us about the carbon farming project at Hope Farm. Sophie will update us on the agroforestry work and give a summary of the carbon calculator tools review. Clara will then discuss the completion of the carbon calculator tools for Hope Farm and the process of working with our volunteer farmers to complete their own assessments. Over to you, Soph.
Thank you very much. I like that we're a Hope Farm double act. That's adorable. Fab. So I'm hoping that has all come up nicely now. So I will get going unless anybody interrupts me. So hi, I am Sophie and I have been leading the Carbon Farming Project for the RSPB for a few years now. So I'm just going to give you an overview and introduction to what the project is looking at and how far we've got so far before I hand over to Clara to go into a little bit more detail about what we have found using Hope Farm as the first part of our case studies. So what are we doing? So the carbon farming project has 3 main elements. So the first is an agroforestry research trial. So as Rob said, this is a 10-year long research trial that we have established at Hope Farm that I will go into in a little bit more detail in a moment. The second is that we are running 3 prominent carbon calculator tools on Hope Farm and several other farms around the UK in different farming systems and countries. That's what Claire is going to cover in a little bit more detail. The 3 tools that we are using, as you can see, are AgriCalc, Cool Farm Tool, and Farm Carbon Toolkit. I'm sure those names will not be strangers to many of you. They are pretty well-known calculators in the UK. And the third is that we are conducting a review into those tools and calculators, into their methodologies, what data they're putting into their models, where their strengths and weaknesses lie, and importantly for us, how well they are including biodiversity. So, carbon farming, why are we doing it? As a brief overview, the Global Paris Agreement stated we must limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. The IPCC special report set out that to achieve this, the world needs to be at net zero CO2 emissions by around 2050. Agriculture is the second largest contributing sector in the UK and globally, and in the UK accounts for a growing proportion of emissions as other sectors decarbonise slightly quicker at around 11%. Slightly differently to other sectors where carbon dioxide is the largest emitting gas, agriculture, our emissions actually consist of 58% methane, 28% nitrous oxide, and only 14% carbon dioxide. So we are slightly different. In order for us to make any changes, we need to be able to calculate and understand the existing greenhouse gas flux on our farming systems. So the aim of this project, we want a better understanding of the processes and these calculators so that we're able to advise other farmers, we're able to advise policymakers and other advisors. We want to make sure that the calculators are inclusive of nature and the whole farming system so that we're aiming for win-wins for the biodiversity nature crisis as well as the climate crisis. And we want to research how agroforestry works and what it delivers on our farm, which leads us quite nicely into looking a little bit more about agroforestry. So why are we looking at agroforestry? There are a lot of potential benefits, such as differences to air quality, as well as CO2 sequestration. It can affect soil quality, structure, increasing organic matter. It can improve water infiltration and prevent runoff. It can be beneficial for a lot of invertebrate and pollination services. Well documented, there are many, many benefits for livestock if implemented correctly. And it is a business diversification, which in a changing climate is only smart for a lot of us to be looking at how we can strengthen our business by diversifying. Oh, sorry about that, didn't mean to click that. It's also a bit of a buzzword for meeting government targets. There are lots of targets in the UK about nature recovery and about tree planting. Agroforestry could be a good solution to help with some of those targets, but only if it's used correctly. It's not commercially common in the UK, though it is more widely practiced on the continent in places like Italy, France, Germany, Holland. It's pretty poorly researched and understood in a UK context, though the evidence pool is growing with more research happening all the time. There's also quite a severe lack of advice and understanding on how to manage and implement an agroforestry system successfully on your farm. So we really want to know what it actually delivers for us. So what are we doing? So we are looking at alley cropping, a type of agroforestry where you have alleys of cropping in between tree strips, as you can see by that lovely picture there. So we have got an 11-hectare field. It's got 8 lines of trees in. The alleys in between are 24 metres for cropping. The tree lines themselves are 6 metres wide, and they were first established with a wildflower mix. And we have got 3 types of trees in this field. So we've got just over 1,000 trees. We've got 200 apple trees of 13 varieties. They'll be going for juicing when they're eventually up and producing. We've also got around 200 native broadleaves. Their only job is to provide some shelter belt to break up the wind that rolls through the field and protect the apples and cob nuts and create a bit of a microclimate. So there's 7 species of those. And we've also got around 600 cob nuts of 3 varieties, and we are hoping that they will be going to make cob nut oil to complement our existing production of rapeseed oil. As Rob said, this is a research trial with at least 10 years of monitoring happening, and we are looking at a whole suite of different things. So we've got 27 sampling points in this field, and then another 27 in our control field, which is under the same treatment and management, but doesn't have any flowers or trees in. And we're doing that to measure the effects in the cropping alleys, but in the tree strips, and how far the effects are actually spreading out into our production as well as under the trees. So we're looking at sort of 3 main categories here. We're looking at biodiversity. There's a whole suite of different things there that are methods to look at a wide range of invertebrates. And this is probably going to be the thing that changes the quickest and could have a lot of potential impacts on the cropping in the field. And we're also looking at bat monitoring, full breeding bird surveys and wintering bird surveys as well. So we can get a really, really good picture of how the biodiversity in this field has changed as a result of these trees now being in place. We're also looking at carbon monitoring and greenhouse gas flux. So we're looking at both climate and nature with this to see what happens. So we are taking soil measurements at 0 to 15 and 15 to 30 centimetres into the soil. We are doing vegetation sampling of the wildflower strips and the trees as they grow, so we can create our own allometric equations and get an accurate data set of what is being pulled down out of the atmosphere as these trees and wildflowers stay in place and continue to grow. We do also have a flux tower in the field, which is my favourite piece of kit ever. It's really, really amazing. It's very exciting. It was kindly funded by a couple of generous donors and is run in conjunction with the Centre of Ecology and Hydrology. That's because it takes 20 measurements a second, so it creates these massive, massive, massive data sets that have to be run through a very clever supercomputer and digested a bit before it comes back to us in a nicer format for us to be able to understand what is going on. But essentially, along with a bunch of meteorological data, it measures the CO2 flux for a large footprint of the field. So that's the flux of carbon dioxide between the land surface and the atmosphere, which gives us a really accurate idea of what is changing in that field as a result of having the trees and the flowers in place. And then, as if that wasn't enough, we are taking a few more different measurements as well. So we're having a really close eye on what happens to our yield in the cropping alleys in this field. We have taken around 15% of the cropping area out of production in order to put these trees in place. There may be advantages for the cropping in terms of improved integrated pest management. There may be disadvantages in terms of different shading, but we don't know. So we're monitoring that very, very closely so we can see exactly what happens. We're also looking at any weed burden changes that may occur in the crops as a result of having these permanent vegetation strips so frequently throughout the cropping. We're also looking at soil bulk density and soil moisture as indicators of the soil health and soil structure changing. We are hoping to get some water quality monitoring up and running very soon in the hope that potentially with reduced surface runoff, having the agroforestry in place may change the water quality coming off of the field. So how it's going. So this was planted in the winter of 21-22. As you may remember, we had some challenges the following year. The major one was that we had one of the longest droughts in living memory of the summer of 2022. Young trees are particularly susceptible to drought. They did not enjoy it, and I did not enjoy it either, as I tried to keep them alive and struggled quite significantly. Because of that, we did have some issues with survival rates. Now, the apples actually had about a 95% survival rate, which is pretty impressive, but we did basically throw the kitchen sink at them to desperately keep them alive as the most expensive trees that we had put in. The cob nuts, I didn't mean to move that on. Cob nuts, we sadly only had about a 20% survival rate in the first year. This wasn't entirely down to the drought. There was actually an issue with them when they were delivered to us that the supplier did take accountability for and replace free of charge. They were replanted the next year with a much better survival rate. We're looking at about 75% survival on that now. The native broadleaves, we lost about 50% in their first year, but they basically had no love and attention and were left to just fend for themselves as the sort of least important trees in there when we had to prioritise. So I actually think that's quite good that they lasted as well as they did, and again have been replanted in the following winter. Another challenge is pest damage. People always talk to you about deer. Deer is your biggest pest when you put trees in anywhere, so that's what we were prepared for. We were not prepared for the damage that came from the badgers, that came from the voles, and came from the rabbits, which have definitely caused me far more sleepless nights than the deer. And the ongoing maintenance has definitely been more than we anticipated. Again, the drought wasn't ideal and did require a lot of manpower, and then the subsequent replanting every winter. But along with their general maintenance, having to check their guards, re-guarding them and moving them as they grow, weeding them, remulching them, rechipping them every year is quite substantial. Financial, how it's going. So far it has cost around £25,000, and that is not including staff time or manpower that has gone into keeping it going. So it's not a cheap thing to do. And we will have to see if it is worth the money in the end. I hope it will be. It's resource heavy, so of course that is a financial implication as well in terms of having to reallocate manpower. It's been slower growing than it was predicted. Again, this is probably due to the drought in their first year, that they pretty much lost an entire year of growth in where they focused on just staying alive. They were incredibly stressed. And we have seen an ongoing consequence of that, where they have been a little bit slower to catch up to where we thought they would be. So you already got a delayed return on investment with trees because you have to wait until they're big enough to start producing, but that has been delayed even further. And the research. So unfortunately, trees don't grow very quickly. It's not something we can measure and churn out results immediately, as much as we would love to be able to do so. We have conducted our first full year of sampling, so looking at all of those things that I mentioned on the previous slide in the summer of 2003. That did produce thousands and thousands and thousands of pots of invertebrates and lots of record dating sheets for butterflies and birds and all sorts of things. So we are still crunching those numbers. And as soon as we have them, we will be able to start putting out things anecdotally, because it's still a little bit too early on for us to draw any real conclusions. Again, we've only had one full year of the flux data. CEH are currently crunching the annual review of that data for us, and hopefully we'll give it back to us in a nicer format that we will also make available. Moving on to the calculator review part of the project. So originally, we were working through the methodologies to get a better understanding of how the calculators work. We then realised that DEFRA had commissioned ADAS to conduct a similar review that was very recently released. I do recommend anybody who is interested to go and have a read of it. It's very thorough and a really good report. But it has already done a large chunk of the work that we were aiming to do, which has been a great help. So now we are working to build upon that report, look at the things that have changed since it was conducted, and continue to improve that knowledge base. So if you don't know, the ADAS report ran up to 20 model farms on 6 calculators, including the 3 that we are focused on. And it covered quite a few farm types. So it covered cereals, general cropping, horticulture, mixed farms, pigs, poultry, dairy, grazing livestock in less favourable areas, and grazing livestock in the lowland. There were a lot of findings and a lot of discussion that could be hours and hours of talk on its own. So just as a quick overview, calculators are materially different in the standards and protocols to which they align. Their coverage of different enterprises is slightly different, and their transparency, rigor, consistency, and functionality are all doing slightly different things. There is quite a high level of variation in the outputs produced by the different calculators. The greatest divergence in that was seen in farms with organic soils, so particularly peatland soils created really massive levels of divergence in the outputs. Also, farms where you've got high levels of soya feed, so this is more poultry systems. And also the lowland livestock, so beef and sheep on lowland livestock farms created quite different results. Surprisingly, dairy farm results were actually much more aligned, much more similar between the calculators. But although there are similarities in the overall emissions figure produced, the relative contribution of the individual emission sources, so the gases and where they come from, was quite variable between the calculators. And lastly, where carbon stock changes are included, not all the calculators include them, divergence is increased quite dramatically. As I said, for peat and organic soils, it can change up to 1,000% difference within calculators for the same information. So that definitely changes the game slightly. So if we look at the key sources of divergence, we've got crop residues. The calculators all vary slightly in how they account for crop residues remaining on the field, which leads to differences in how much nitrogen is assumed to be lost as nitrous oxide. Also, enteric emissions, that's quite different between calculators. Some allow more precise data entry, which allows you to calculate methane emissions more tailored to feed and livestock management, while others make slightly broader assumptions. Embedded emissions, so this is particularly for feed and for fertilizer. Most of the calculators use the Global Feed LCA Institute database for feed emissions, but not entirely for everything, and not all of them use it the same way. The approach to land use inclusion varies, and this is where a lot of the difference comes from. So this is especially important with soya, again, depending on where you are getting it in the world, will depend on how the land use change is affected in those emissions and whether or not that's taken into account. And for fertilizer production, there wasn't a consistent set of emissions factors used for fertilizer production. There's several different databases in use. Some of them come from the manufacturers directly, but there's just a bit of variation in that. Next one is manure management. So there are differences in accounting for manure quantity and management practices. Some of the calculators have a greater usability to define what happens to manures and farming system. In others, there's a bit of a gap in the calculations between the production of the manure, if you're a livestock or mixed system, the production handling and storage. This one comes up a lot. The range of methods and emissions factors used for nitrous oxide emissions are quite variable. Some of the calculators use international figures, others are slightly more UK specific, but they're all using slightly different numbers. And as we said, carbon stock changes change the playing field quite a lot, and this can be down to system boundaries. Not all the calculators include the same areas in their assessments, which can change what carbon stock is included in the assessment, and there can be a different assumed figure. So if we look at factors driving the differences, so as we've said, system boundaries, calculators apply different boundaries and different range of system boundaries. They also differ in which enterprises they assess and where they draw the lines around those enterprises. For some of the calculators, the boundaries are set by the user, and some of them are fixed in terms of what the calculator is able to assess. Data entry makes a really big difference. There is a balance and there is a trade-off with these calculators in terms of the amount of data required. And then therefore the burden on the user against the extent of assumptions the calculator has to make in the absence of robust data. So the more data you can put into a calculator, the more granular your output and output number will be. But it does create an extra burden on the user, and there is a trade-off as to how much sort of limited returns, how much more information you can give, how much more accurate that response can be. Emissions factors. So for things like energy, there are standardized data sets for UK energy emissions produced by the government. They're widely used, widely accepted, and that's kind of a no-brainer. There are some standardized emissions factors for feed products, again from the Global Feed LCA initiative, and also for many fertilizers from Fertilizers Europe. These databases are updating and changing all the time, as are the tools. So not all of the tools are quite on the same page as to where they are with using those standard databases. Some of them use specific emissions factors from manufacturers instead of using the databases, and some use a mixture of the two or other scientific research. Calculation and assumptions. So emissions from methane and nitrous oxide are pretty much for all the calculators based on IPCC guidelines. However, within those guidelines, there are tier 1, 2, and 3 approaches and associated emission factors, the use of which varies. Land-based carbon removals and emissions. So this is one of the definite difficult things to measure and define in a calculator, and they all do a cracking job, but there isn't a single consistent approach to assess carbon removals or emissions from soils, from vegetation, or from land use change. Some of the calculators use the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, land sector and removals guidance. Others are more aligned with the ISO standards, particularly 14064-2. Others align with the IPCC tier methodologies for carbon stock change in mineral soils. However, none of those processes are specifically aimed at assessing sequestration at farm scale. And rarely in the calculators are there sufficient questions asked to understand the permanence, additionality, and leakage that may be associated with those factors. To be able to account for removal against any of those standards, you are required to provide a quantitative uncertainty estimate. So this would be able to tell you how confident you can be in the result you're producing, which none of them, a couple of them do, but not all of them do. Land-based carbon removal is a very difficult thing to measure. There are a lot of things that you need to know and accurately assess that aren't really feasible or practical to do. There isn't a single robust data set or scientific methodology that can be applied to it. So there are lots of things that you can pick different elements from, but it's, in terms of science and in terms of how this moves, a pretty new area that just hasn't got that standardization behind it as of yet. There's also a difference in the quantification of mitigation. So what I mean by this is that if you're using those tier 1 methodologies, they are limited in their ability to meaningfully include any benefits from mitigation practices. So again, if your calculator is making a lot of assumptions and broader estimates on your behalf rather than accurate data, it does mean it probably can't capture when you change something to be able to account for that mitigation. And the inclusion of newer mitigation strategies are coming out all the time. So whether they're using the inclusion of nitrogen inhibitors, urea inhibitors, different technology, anaerobic digesters, methane and nitrous oxide captures on slurry storage, there's all different technologies emerging, and the calculators are at various different stages of being able to incorporate that technology into their calculations. So conclusions so far, though I must stress this work is not finished yet, is that first of all, it's important to remember that there is no single correct answer. All the calculators are models, and they all do a pretty good job. So as such, there is no ranking of the calculators, but there is a greater need to understand what they deliver individually to help you select the tool best suited to you. We need better definitions for what is included or what should be included in farm level assessments from top down. So whether this is from supply chains, whether this is from the industry, or whether this is from the government. We need to understand what we are trying to assess. We need to agree where we should draw the boundaries, what enterprises can be covered, what is the end goal from doing these assessments, and also what is the individual person's financial contribution. Most of these calculators are not free, so there is a limitation in that as well. And lastly, there needs to be a much greater transparency in the confidence that we can have in the results any calculator gives us. It needs to be clearer what assumptions have been made and what the error range is around that, so you can bear that in mind for future decision making. So what is next? So as I said, we are building on the ADAS report. Since that report, all of the calculators have been through major updates. So we are currently reviewing those changes to see how they have improved and adapted. All the calculators, amazingly, have responded really positively to the report and are all working to make further improvements that look really promising. And as we build on the report, we'll be focusing on the transparency and confidence of the calculators, the mitigation and advice they provide, and how well they include the whole farming system and any biodiversity implications that may be affected as a result of decisions for mitigation. So that is an overview of the project and what we are looking at. I will hand over, I don't know if I'm handing back to Rob or straight to Clara, but Clara is going to talk to you a little bit more about the case studies part of the work. So looking at calculators in use across the UK.
I'll just hop in, spare Rob from having to go again. Okay, cool. So as Sophie said, obviously we're working on these three different calculators. We decided to use Hope Farm as our sort of own arable case study, just so that I could get some sort of experience using the tools myself before, asking other farmers to do it with me. And obviously provides an insight into our own emissions, which is very helpful. But also so that we can provide some feedback on the general usability of the calculators to the tool makers. And also the reason we sort of onboarded some farmers from some different systems was to help provide insight into which calculators may best suit different farming systems. So just as a sort of overview of using the calculators, sort of the main characteristics, Farm Carbon Toolkit is quite well-rounded. It's unique in its availability for things like inputting stewardship, and has the most in-depth data availability for hedgerows, and has capacity for both cropping and livestock. Cool Farm Tool has a slightly different structure. It's more of a product-based tool, so where you need to complete individual assessments. But it goes into slightly more granular detail for cropping and much more detail for livestock. Unfortunately, at the moment, some of the livestock modules aren't available, but that's because they're in the process of being updated, so we expect to see those back at some point in the near future. AgriCalc is also quite a well-rounded tool. It's got quite good ability to process livestock information, and it's also got cropping system availability too. So for our case studies, we tried to get a broad range of participants. We unfortunately didn't succeed in getting a dairy farmer from Northern Ireland. So we were very lucky that our Somerset volunteer signed up as our dairy participant. Unfortunately, this map doesn't have some of the islands, but you can see sort of the range of our participants who are volunteering their time, which we're very grateful for. So yeah, we're broadly spread as much as we could get. So it's been a relatively straightforward process, in theory, to get the farmers to complete this project with us. We initially had to get people onboarded, making sure that farmers had time to work with us, because they are incredibly busy people, and get them set up with their logins and such. and then we had to go through the actual point of data collection. We are still at that point, but we're largely hoping to have the most of the data sort of collated by the end of March so that I have time to process it in April. So we're somewhere between stage 2 and stage 3 at the moment, where I'm kind of assisting farmers with inputting their data, and sort of booking in regular check-ins to make sure that everybody's on track and that I can help answer questions as needed. Once we have all the data from the farmers, we will be able to collect this through a feedback form that we've created that will hopefully sort of round up all of the main points that we'd like to know and make sure that the farmers have a chance to give their feedback. And this will then go on to the tool creators, who will be able to sort of share the experiences with from our own case study, but also the farmers that we've had participating. I won't share which, but each farmer seems to have experienced a preference to date. But it'll be interesting to see whether this preference is either result-based or usability-based. I suspect there might be a preference for the one that makes their system look the best, but time will tell. So we're hoping to be able to put out a report on this in May, sometime in Q2 of this year, but all will be revealed in terms of how easy it is for us to get hold of the data and process it all. So we've already been through this for Hope Farm, spent some time last year pulling together all of our data to put into the calculators. You can see that there's a graph here with our results for different sectors. Interestingly, Farm Carbon Toolkit gave us our lowest output at negative 858.79. And as you can see, that's probably largely due to the substantial carbon stock changes you can see on the orange bar on the graph there. AgriCalc gave us our middle result, saying that we're emitting 317.94 tons of CO2 equivalent. And then Cool Farm Tool is the next at 406.46. So those two are a little closer together. But you can see that Cool Farm Tool has a much a more significant carbon stock change figure, but I'll go into that a little bit shortly. In terms of my user experience, having done these myself as somebody who was a complete novice to agricultural carbon calculators, it was a pretty steep learning curve. I did start with Farm Carbon Toolkit and I found this the easiest to complete, but I think that might be bias just through me navigating through it, or potentially just the way my brain works with the layout. So as you can see, the calculator requirements are largely the same, but there are a few differences. So I've obviously indicated this here with a tick and cross system. And the ticks that have an additional plus are ones that ask for a significant amount of detail sort of over and above the other calculators. But they will largely require the same sort of standard information that should be easily at hand for most farmers once you know what you're looking for. So that's just a kind of simple overview there. I'm aware that there will be things changing on each calculator, and they may well have changed since I put this table together sort of at the end of last year. But I have it on good authority that more modules will be incorporated into each of the calculators with time. So just back to this graph, just so I can talk through it a little bit. As I've mentioned, you can see that we've got quite similar sequestration figures for Farm Carbon Toolkit and Cool Farm Tool, but Cool Farm Tool is still in the positive for the emissions, so we're still emitting carbon. And this is probably in part due to the large fertilizer production emissions that we have, and also the transport figure. The fertilizer production emissions account for where it's manufactured and the associated transport, as Sophie mentioned. But this is, it's a bit tricky because, for example, as you can see, we've sort of broken it up into these categories, and they're not sort of all encompassing, because as you can see, Farm Carbon Toolkit has 0 emissions for fertilizer production, which isn't strictly true. They just incorporate it into their sort of entire soil and fertilizer emissions. So it's not separated out in the same way that the other tools do. So the figure is still there, but it's not quite as clean cut to do a direct comparison. Cool Farm tool obviously gave us our sort of middle result. And this one has the most sort of moderate emissions, shown in green on the graph. And it has more moderate emissions, and also the sequestration is much lower than the other two. But we'll need to sort of look into why this is and investigate in a little bit more detail. But you can see that there are either sections where everything is quite similar, or there's a really broad range. And at the moment, we seem to have a few reasons as to why we think that might be. We do actually have a blog post available if anybody is interested in reading into this a little bit more, sort of gone a little bit more in depth. And this is obviously quite high level, but I will put the link somewhere for people to have a look at if they're interested. That came out at the end of February, so we haven't had many more data changes since then. But we obviously will be hoping to publish the final report based on sort of the practical calculator use from myself and our volunteer farmers, as well as Sophie's methodology review. So yeah, that's it from me, I think.
Thank you, Clara and Sophie, for that very detailed and informative run through of the various bits of work that are going on as part of the RSPB Carbon Farming Project. So just before we go to a bit of Q&A, just wanted to reflect a little bit on what we've heard this evening. Initially, Jenny talked to us about the sort of plot scale work and the primary research that she's been doing to elucidate the effects of, in some ways, quite subtle changes in soil management and how those are reflected in both soil biodiversity and emissions. And then we heard from the agroforestry trial how we're looking at that across a whole field at a field scale within a particular management system that is made up of individual practices. And then we heard after that how you might bring all those together across a whole farm's worth of fields using much coarser data to try and predict the impact of your current or future management on the emissions from a farm. So we get an illustration of the complexity of these issues just through the various scales that we've heard about already. And then to add on top of that, the issue that we then have to decide not only how we manage for carbon, but how we manage for productivity, and the implications of those for things like habitat management, natural pest control, and charismatic farm wildlife. So this is not an easy set of issues to deal with. And one other observation, just from the tools point of view, it's quite clear that you can get very different answers by putting the same data into different tools. And so comparison between sites using different tools is probably not where these strengths lie, but it's probably their best strength is to look at the changes you might make in an individual farm using one tool. And the selection should probably be which tool fits your system and your farm and your style of data management the best, rather than which one gives you the best result, because you want to compare through time rather than compare with other farms. Now, I'll invite all the other participants to come back online and see if we've got some questions to answer. Here they come.
You've got me invading the webinar as well, Rob.
Yes, indeed. I'll just introduce. This is Georgie Bray, the Hope Farm manager, who's elbowed her way in as well. So one or two questions here. The first one says, and I think I see where you're coming from. Disappointing to see so much variability in the recording of tools results, and therefore maybe difficult to trade carbon on those figures. I think it's more akin to what I was saying earlier, but have anybody got any reflections on that in terms of farm scale assessment for carbon trading? Shall I pick on someone? Or shall I answer?
If he's being polite, got a hand up.
I'll jump in. I was just as a sort of overview of the tools, is that these tools aren't really designed for carbon trading. So it's important to bear that in mind in terms of if that's what you are aiming for, then you'd probably need to go down a slightly different route. I think it's a really good place to start picking a tool and doing a farm assessment to give you an idea of how your farm is performing, or where your potential improvement areas are, or areas that you're already doing really well on. But these tools haven't got enough on the ground actual measurements for carbon trading. If you're looking more at that, things like the Woodland Carbon Code, the Peatland Carbon Code are really robust codes with strict standardized measurements that are verified by third parties for trading. There are some other platforms specifically for agriculture which do look into that. But yeah, I would say that isn't the aim of these tools, but more to give you a starting point and a way to track your own emissions for your own sort of benefit of improving your farm emissions.
Anybody else want to chip in, or shall I?
I will just say something on
Okay, Jenny.
so I have a slight problem with carbon trading, particularly in agricultural situations, just because of the way carbon needs to be used in agriculture. The way I said it was a currency because it needs to be spent, but maybe currency is the wrong term. The fact is, it's very difficult to trade because you can't guarantee that once it's in the soil, it will stay there, or for how long it will stay there. So what you're actually trading in is something that's very difficult to measure and very difficult to control. So that is not a good basis for a currency, which can cause some problems down the line if you then have traded something that is no longer there. And it also can slightly tie your hands with what you can do with your soil. If you've sold that carbon and you've agreed to keep it there, that really limits you on your ability to do agricultural practices, which do need you to be able to use that carbon and cycle that carbon. So I think there can be some real problems in the way we value carbon, measure carbon, and trade carbon, I think.
Yeah. May I chip in a bit as well, Rob? Just
Please do.
Yeah, just to give a perspective of sort of how whilst managing Hope Farm, how we're looking at the benefits of trying to store carbon. Like the calculators that Claire has run through they're still really useful for us, and we can look where our biggest issues are and help that to try and reduce our emissions as they give an indicator. But from my perspective, having the carbon in the soil, the benefit to that is the services that gives us in the improved manageability of the soil, enabling us to have better infiltration, better resilience of the soil, which I think resilience in soil is hot on everybody's minds with how the weather is at the moment over in the last few years. And better ability to hold on to nutrients and stuff as well. I think they're all the benefits. So you've got the benefit of having more carbon in the soil and just wanting to reduce our emissions on the whole. And if reducing emissions means reducing nitrogen use, that's going to save us a bit of money as well, potentially.
Excellent, thank you. Another question here for Jenny, particularly referring to your comparisons between direct drill and plough. We've seen that there are implications for the carbon cycling in the soil, but also the rates of emission and the amount of carbon stored. How does this is this reflected in ease of management and yield and gross margin for the crops grown in that way? So what is the trade-off in production for that?
Yeah, so we've not actually seen a significant reduction in yield in either the plough or the direct drill plots. They've been about the same, maybe a slight reduction sometimes in the direct drill plots when the weather's been particularly bad for making it difficult to get a good seed bed, or maybe making it difficult to get that initial flush of nitrogen, and we haven't been able to get on early enough with our first application of nitrogen. The plants may suffer at the beginning. But overall, because of the savings on farm time and tractor time, when we do the economical analysis, we've found that we get a slight benefit of the direct drill plots because of the money we save on all that additional work that goes into preparing those other plots. Yeah.
Thanks. A follow-up from me, I think, given the wet weather and the nature of your soils that I think are not the lightest soils over at Loddington. Have you noticed any restrictions you had to impose on yourselves on the direct drill plots in terms of not damaging, being more cautious about damaging soil structure and causing compaction when the soil's wet, because you can't go in and correct it with the plough?
Yeah, so there has been in the last few years instances when we've wanted to put in a winter wheat crop and we've had to switch to spring cropping, and that's a problem, and that's a problem because it's not such a profitable crop. But also, if you make that decision quite late, it does mean you end up leaving your soil uncovered, which is not ideal for a soil. So there really are challenges to do with the weather that we are perhaps slightly behind in deciding what to do, but we've been having meetings and deciding our backup plans in advance and how to farm in a new way. So I think we're learning at the same time as everyone else, but hopefully if we can get some ideas on how to deal with this terrible weather, we can pass them on to everybody.
Can I chip in there again as well? Because
Please do. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, we've had like similar things at Hope Farm where direct drilling can have its benefits, but if it's been left without some sort of cover or catch crop drilled, and then we're waiting for winter wheat to be drilled, and then we end up as like an overwinter stubble, that can be such a bad thing for our soils. You kind of have the worst of both worlds there, and then it just ends up as like this strawy stuff holding in the moisture underneath. And yeah, we're both on clay soils, so it's really difficult. And we've tried in more recent years to establish like a catch crop, which if it ends up having to be extended to nearly be a cover crop, it's not going to deliver much as the more expensive covers, which are like mixes that are designed to stay in the soil all winter. But it gives us a little bit of an insurance policy. And I think we've talked about pesticides being used as an insurance policy before, which is a bad thing, but actually using cover crops and things to restore soil as an insurance policy is something that we're focusing a lot more on. Not getting it right all the time, like because we had such a late harvest, our catch crops didn't go in nearly as early as we'd like, so they weren't nearly as big as we'd like them to be. But I hope it still did something to keep the soil alive and functioning a bit better.
Lovely, thanks, Georgie. Another question here. In the agroforestry belts, the wildflowers tend to get taken over by less desirable thistles and brome grasses after around 5 years. Any thoughts on ongoing management of these strips? I think I'll give that to Sophie.
I was going to
Sorry,
say,
let me
that's over to you,
unmute.
Sophie.
Yeah, so it's one of the things we are sort of monitoring is how the strips progress on their own. They do all get an autumn cut and bale, so it's similar way to we would manage wildflowers elsewhere on the farm to try and pull the nutrients out from the flower strips. We do then have to try and remulch and wood chip directly around the trees to make sure we're keeping the nutrients under the trees where we need them, but we don't want them in the flowers. But yes, they are already starting to have patches of thistles that are sort of slightly downhill where there's probably a bit of nutrient run down and sat, and it's particularly rich soil, which we are managing sort of by hand at the moment in terms of going out with, we just got a new brush cutter to be able to just go around and try and take out some of those patches before they set seed. But it's something that we are monitoring for the longer term of the project in terms of how much of a problem that might become. We obviously can't really reseed the strips now because they have trees in them, so there's not too much you can do in terms of re-establishing. So we are just going to keep an eye on how it changes. Hopefully there will be lots of other nicer things come in as well. There should be a shift to a more perennial system with the balance of grasses and more perennial flowers in there in the long run. And obviously as the trees get bigger, they will increase the shading over those strips as well. So you're going to lose some of the annuals that are really all about the solar and get more of the shade tolerant species coming in. So it's something we're just going to have to keep an eye on, manage as and when we can, and write down everything we do so that we can make sure that all of that is recorded as maintenance you need to consider when trying to put trees and flowers in the middle of your field.
Thanks, Sophie. Anything to add, Georgie? Or shall I put in my 2 pence?
No, I was going to say it's been really helpful with work with the neighbour who's got a flail collector, which has enabled them to run up and down and do that management, because managing them with the normal sort of tractor doing the cutting and then coming back and rowing it up and doing the baling like we do on our other margins just wouldn't be possible. I think if we stuck a hay turner near the trees, Sophie would have something to say about it. And yeah, I guess if this thing becomes something that is more common in the countryside, then there'll be more of these kind of tools and services, so that could be a separate enterprise. But yeah, it wouldn't be worth us buying a separate flail collector just for those 11 hectares, for sure.
No, thank you, Georgie. I was just going to say, just to add on to that, we know from other long-term vegetation strips on the farm that have been managed for floral diversity, that I think the key is to keep reducing the nutrients, and therefore if you're cutting, to take the cuttings off. And the other thing is to avoid soil disturbance. As soon as you get soil disturbance, it gives these sort of pioneer species like thistles and bromes a chance to get in. If you can avoid that disturbance and keep the nutrients down, you've got a chance of doing that. But clearly that takes some effort as well. And you need to design your vegetation for what you're going to be able to deal with in the future. So wide or narrow strips around the trees. It may give you an agrochemical buffer, but it also means you've got more to cut. A question for Clara now. How long did those tools take to complete? How long does it take to enter all your data per tool? Is it an arduous process?
As someone with previously very little agricultural background, it takes a little bit of time to get yourself up to speed on what everything means. I would say that once you've completed one calculator, it's a lot quicker to complete the others, if you're interested in finding out what each calculator would give you. But I'd say for me personally, it probably took me about 3 months, maybe 4, just to completely tie up all the loose ends. And there was some sort of back and forth just to make sure that everything was in properly, sort of from my understanding as much as anything. So if you know what you're talking about, unlike me, when you begin, it should be a much quicker process. So I wouldn't expect it to take more than a few weeks on and off, probably, for somebody who's more familiar with the whole thing, if that's any consolation.
Okay, so you essentially, that is time well spent if it means that in the future it doesn't take you very long if you're doing a longitudinal study as you're looking at change through time.
Yeah, definitely. And this with sorry.
No, carry on.
I was just going to say, with some of the tools, you can kind of build on it year on year. So you don't have to input everything from scratch. Some of the data would still be there, and you can create an additional assessment and just change some of the scenarios. So it's not always from scratch, if that makes sense. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. And a question to both Clara and Sophie. So when will the results from the case studies be out? And when can we expect the sort of final report on usability and tool differences and the like, or our interpretation of the DEFRA report?
The case studies, I'm hoping to have the data available and ready to present by the end of April. It just depends on how long it takes to sort of tie all those bits up with all of the volunteers. So hopefully something should be coming out April, May time.
Okay, thanks. And where will we be able to find those? Presumably through the RSPB website or through our socials feeds?
Yes.
Yeah. The other part of it will be the sort of same time frame. So we should have the outputs all out in sort of early to mid-May. Yeah, and they will be linked on our social media, and they will be on the website, and I'm sure we will have them on our own social medias as well, because we have spent a long time looking at them. So we are going to be very proudly pushing them out to anyone who wants to know what we've done.
Brilliant, thank you. Just one very last call if there are any more questions on the Q&A. And if they don't come through, then I just want to say a big thank you to our presenters today, to Jenny, to Sophie, and to Clara for giving us the benefit of their wisdom on these various things that they've been looking at for what seems like an age, and is a very complex issue, and cuts across a whole different set of scales, and with other issues that take up farmers' time. So thank you for giving us the benefit of your experience there. Any questions that come through later, please, we will try and respond to those afterwards by various methods. Just remains to me to thank presenters, to thank Georgie, and to thank our team in the background who've been making sure that this runs smoothly, to Anna and to Hayley. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next
Wait a minute, Rob. Wait.
Sorry.
There will also be blog write-ups of this webinar and all the last ones and all of the past recordings, and this will be put up on the Farm Wildlife YouTube channel, which will also be linked on our RSPB Hope Farm Twitter account.
Brilliant. All that young person stuff that I can't do.
All of that. Oh, exactly.
Lovely. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for all attending and listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.